All right, folks, welcome to Kabbalah and Coffee. All right, so this is our first Kabbalah and Coffee session in the new year, the new decade, 2020. Super exciting. And we have a lot to talk about. So today's topic is, our overall topic is learning how to love, how to get along with others. And specifically, our topic today is how to better understand other people's opinions on things. This is a very important topic because we all have opinions and other people have opinions, and we have opinions on other people's opinions, right? Sometimes very strong opinions about other people's opinions. And the goal is to learn how to get along, how to better get along with other people. So I want to begin with a section from the Talmud. We're going to begin with a Talmudic exploration and then move into the Kabbalah, the mystical way of understanding it. So the first thing I'm going to do is pass around this sheet of the Talmud. Okay. Please take and pass. Good morning. Please take and pass. Now this is coming from Talmud Tractate Tainit, which a copy or a version of that I have with me right here. This is what I wanted to show you. This is the Koren edition of the Talmud, and it is a translation, English edition of the Talmud based on the works, translation, and interpretation of Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who is a modern scholar, a very prominent scholar living in the land of Israel.
Is that, I guess, all the Talmuds?
They have, they just finished it probably, a year ago or maybe half a year ago. They have the whole Talmud now translated. I mean, there are other versions also, but this is one version. Okay, so Talmud Tractate Tainit 20a. This is what we're studying. Does everyone have a copy? Did you get a copy?
No.
Are there extra copies? Did they make it around? Thank you. Yeshakov, perfect. Okay, I'm going to read this. Cedars and reeds. When I was a kid growing up in Pittsburgh, we used to go to an amusement park in Sandusky, Ohio, called Cedar Point. You guys remember Cedar Point? Still around. Fantastic. Okay, cedars and reeds. Here we go. The prophet, I don't even know how to pronounce this in the transliteration, so I'm just going to tell you what his name really was. The prophet Achia Hashiloni, Achia the Shilonite, cursed Israel in the following terms. Let me explain. Achia Hashiloni was a Jewish prophet. He's said to have lived hundreds of years, not ago, but 400s of years. Although he lived in the times of the kings, King Solomon and subsequent kings, although he lived in that era, i.e. many, many, many years, many centuries after, after those who the Bible tells us lived like 900 years, still he is said to have also lived for like 900 years, something on that level. He was also a mystic. He was a prophet. He was a mystic, and it says that he started teaching, that he was the primary teacher of Kabbalah to the Baal Shem Tov, that his soul came to the Baal Shem Tov and taught the Baal Shem Tov mysticism. Achia Hashiloni used to come to him, his spirit, and teach him Kabbalah and what would lead to the development of the Hasidic movement. Anyway, that's a little bit about a bit of the bio about Achia Hashiloni. Now, Achia Hashiloni, let me give you more of a bio. Achia Hashiloni was living in the times, he lived in many times, but including the times of when the northern kingdom split from, when Israel split into two kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So there were three, let's talk about the Jewish kings. There was King Saul. The throne was taken away from Saul because of what he did with the war against Amalek, and it was given to King David. King David reigned for a number of years. King Solomon reigned after him, Shlomo HaMelech, after King Solomon, his son Rehoboam reigned, or Rehoboam, I think how it's pronounced in English. And at that point, the kingdom splits into two. Why? Because Rehoboam, he, on a very practical level, he levied a lot of taxes, and the people didn't like the taxes, so they decided to split up. There were other reasons also, spiritual reasons, but they split into two kingdoms, the kingdom to the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. That's how it was known. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, was in the southern kingdom, and this split caused it to be where the southern kingdom had the holy temple, the northern kingdom didn't, and the kings of the northern kingdom, so historically they sought to compensate for not having a temple by creating other forms of worship which weren't always in concert with the Jewish way of worship. You with me so far? The first of the kings of the north was Yerovam, or Jeroboam. Yeah. So Yerovam was supported by Achia Hashiloni. This prophet Achia Hashiloni is the one who actually encouraged Yerovam to break away, to start the northern kingdom, and to be the king. But shortly thereafter, Jeroboam, went off the rails, as I mentioned. He put actually officers to stop people from making a pilgrimage to the southern kingdom to go to the temple. You know, it's a biblical mitzvah when there was a temple to go during the 3 pilgrimage holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. It was a mitzvah to go to the temple, to go to Jerusalem. And he put officers to stop people from going because he didn't want people to pay any sort of, to give any sort of credence or demonstration of loyalty to the southern kingdom. He wanted to keep everything in the northern kingdom. He put up altars, like worship altars for other forms of worship, so that people would have something to do if they weren't going to the temple to offer sacrifices there. So very soon it spiraled into a not so kosher state. And at that point, Achia Hashiloni began to prophesy that this was not going to end well. The northern kingdom would be destroyed, and the Jews would not survive. And indeed, that's what happened years later. What happened was that there were forces that came in and exiled the northern kingdom. If you've ever heard of the 10 lost tribes, that's why. 10 lost tribes, 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south. The 10 tribes in the north were exiled, displaced. This was a time before it was easy to track anybody. Of course, and today we have different methods, but back then, if somebody was taken and displaced and moved moved around, there wasn't really a way to track people. Okay, so let's jump in. The prophet Achia Hashiloni cursed Israel in the following terms. Remember, he was a Jewish prophet and a tzaddik, a righteous person, but he was cursing in the sense that he was giving a foreboding prophecy. And here's the quote from the book of Kings. For the Lord will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. That's the quote from the prophecy, from this foreboding prophecy. That God will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. So imagine a reed shaking, kind of quivering in the water. So that's how God will smite Israel. So that's the verse. Rav Yehuda said, that Rav said, this too is for a blessing. Although it sounds like a curse, it's also a blessing. As Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, we like to quote original sources in the Talmud. You notice that? Nothing is just stated without an address, without a passport. Everything has address, we know who it is, etc. Shkoyach, thank you. I'll pass it. Yeah, it's about giving credit, 100%. Okay, so as Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, what is the meaning of that which is written in Proverbs? King Solomon wrote Proverbs. Look what it says. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. What a powerful verse, right? Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. You would think a wound is not good and a kiss is good. So King Solomon says, not so fast. Depends who's doing the wounding and who's doing the kissing. Sometimes a rebuke from a friend is positive, whereas a demonstration of love from an enemy is a setup for, God forbid, something worse, something negative. So he says, what's the explanation of this, or where do we see this manifest and play out? The curse with which Achia Shiloni cursed the Jewish people is more effective, or is more positive, than the blessing with which Balaam the wicked blessed them. Achia Shiloni was a good prophet, was a righteous person who chastised the Jewish people. Balaam is the biblical wicked prophet who ends up blessing the people. So the Talmud says, not so fast. The curse of the righteous is better than the blessing of the wicked. Or the curse of your friend is better than the blessing of your enemy. And it explains in the subsequent paragraphs the way this works. This reminds me of, like these types of clever wordplay. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Reminds me of a statement from the Kutzker Rebbe, where he was a Hasidic Rebbe that lived a few hundred years ago. He would have very, very clever ways of expressing things. He would say, there's nothing more straight than a crooked ladder. And there's nothing as black as the white burial shrouds. And there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. He would have these types of expressions of so again, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So let's continue how this plays out with Achia Shiloni and Balaam. Rabbi Yochanan elaborates. Achia the Shilonite, Achia Shiloni, cursed the Jewish people by comparing them to a reed, as we just quoted, for the Lord will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. Although it seems to be a curse, this verse is actually a blessing. How is it a blessing? Just as this reed stands in a place, it cannot move it from its place, rather it sways with them until the winds subside, and the reed still stands in its place. The same applies to the Jewish people. After all the difficulties that they endure, they will ultimately survive and return home. Achia Shiloni is saying that God is going to bring negative destruction, whatever, upon the Jewish people, God forbid. God is going to bring that and will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. Although it seems like a curse, the Talmud says, in fact, it's a blessing. Because why does he liken this situation to a reed? Because a reed, since it's soft, so when something comes against it, it can bend, but ultimately it's not broken. It will bend, but it won't break. And so the Jewish people will be tossed around, but we're going to stay around. We're not going to break. And at some point, we'll be back. However, Balaam the wicked blessed the Jews by comparing them to a cedar. Remember, again, Balaam was the evil prophet who's hired to curse, to bring, God forbid, a downfall to the Jewish people through his words. He was a verbal mercenary, or an oratory mercenary, and he attempts 3 times to curse the Jewish people, and all 3 times what comes out of his mouth are blessings. The Talmud says, not so fast. Even his blessings still have hints of curses. Look at what he says here, Numbers 24:6. He says, "Matovu alecha Yaakov mishkanesecha Yisrael." How good, Matovu alecha. How good are your tents, Yaakov? Your dwelling place is Israel. And then he says, you're like the cedars that are beside the waters. You're like the river that flows. Very beautiful and poetic. It sounds very nice and very, very laudatory. All right, the Talmud says not so fast. He says the Jewish people are like cedars beside the waters. The Talmud says, just as this cedar does not stand in a place of water. Cedars don't grow in water. And its shoots do not replenish themselves. And its roots are not numerous. Balaam wished that the same should apply to the Jewish people. Furthermore, while it is true that even if all the winds in the world blow against it, they will not move it from its place, the Talmud says, once the southern wind blows against it, it uproots the cedar and turns it on its face. What is the southern wind? Well, if you're from the south, kidding. What is a southern wind? It means a strong wind. A strong enough wind is going to come and uproot the cedar tree. You know what they say? The bigger they are, the harder they fall. And so you have a big tree, and it seems like it's impervious. It's to any sort of winds that might blow against it. It's gonna stand forever. The truth is, it's not. Let's continue. And not only that, but the reed merited. So hold on before we get there. So what's the point? The point is that the reed, although the reed is smaller and the reed is soft and it doesn't seem as strong as we would say in Yiddish as stark. You know what stark means? Strong. It's not as robust as the reed. So cedar sounds like a more praiseworthy comparison, right? Who would rather be a cedar than a reed? Yet, if you look at it closely, a reed has an advantage. Why? Because a reed bends and doesn't break. A cedar, hit with the right force, it's going down. And once it's down, it's done. And not only that, the Talmud says, but the reed merited that a quill, kulmos, is taken from it to write with it a Torah scroll, the prophets and the writings. So as the commentary here says, evidently, the bold words are the actual words of the Talmud, and the non-bolded words are the commentary in this edition. Evidently, the curse comparing Israel to a reed is better than the blessing likening them to a cedar.
So we use the cedar for the Mishkan?
You can't mix sessions together. But what David is mentioning is yesterday we had a study before davening, and we spoke about so Shabbat morning we gathered together 8:45 to study some Hasidic philosophy. So we spoke about how the Mishkan, God's tabernacle, was built from cedar wood. All right, listen. They tried to build it from reeds, but it was a little too wavy. Try to put up a reed and try to put a roof on it, not so fast. It's not saying that cedars are evil, or cedars don't have any value, or cedars are somehow a negative force and shouldn't be used in any Jewish context. It's not saying that. Cedars certainly have their advantage and are beautiful and have their place even in God's temple. Nonetheless, at the same time, Balaam's blessing, likening us to a cedar, there might have been a hidden agenda there. The hidden agenda is if you hit it with the right force, it's down and it's out. Whereas the curse from Achia Shiloni, likening us that God's going to smite us like a reed, not such a curse. I mean, we could take out the smiting. That would be obviously better. But, they say in Florida, I mentioned this high holidays, maybe last year or 2 years ago, in our learner service. So, I didn't know this before I saw this. I didn't know this until I knew this, until I found this out. So, you can, if you know any more information, please chime in. But apparently, palm trees, when they're hit by, I know we have a few Floridian or Florida, I guess, whatever. People have spent time in Florida, certainly. So it says that when the hurricanes hit, right? So many of the palm trees bend, but don't break, and eventually they pop back up. That's what happens.
Instead of popping back up, actually they kind of will stay. Sometimes they'll stay bent.
Oh, they do.
And
Oh,
then they'll roll back towards the sun.
oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that. I figured someone had more information to
It's like
to share.
Timex, keeps it licking, keeps on ticking.
That was a good campaign back in the day, but now it's a different world. Okay, good. No one's looking for things that last long. It's like every 2 years you get a new thing, whatever it is, right? So yeah, it doesn't need. Okay, so that's the first page. Now let's turn it over. The Talmud continues. The sages further taught in praise of the reed. You didn't think the Talmud would have pages dedicated or a page dedicated to the virtues of a reed. But here the Talmud continues about the reed. A person should always be soft like a reed and should not be stiff like a cedar. We can understand this, by the way, on many levels, and we're going to get to it in a Kabbalistic on a Kabbalistic level soon. But on a basic level, the way it's described here is, persons should not be so arrogant and haughty that they look down upon others. Rather, be humble like a reed, soft like a reed, and not be stiff like a cedar. An incident occurred. This is a very disturbing incident. an incident occurred in which Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the mystic, the Kabbalist, spent 13 years in a cave with his son Rabbi Elazar, studying Kabbalah. Okay, so Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, came from Migdal Gadar, from his rabbi's house, and he was riding on a donkey and strolling on the bank of the river. And he was very happy. And his head was swollen with pride because he had studied much Torah. You see where this is headed. Probably not in a good direction. He happened upon an exceedingly ugly person who said to him, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." But Rabbi Elazar did not return his greeting. Instead, Rabbi Elazar said to him, "Worthless Reka person, how ugly is that man? Are all the people of your city as ugly as you?" Right? This is...
I got burned.
This is... This doesn't sound so cool, right? The man said to him, "I do not know, but you should go and say to the craftsman who made me, how ugly is the vessel you made." Right? So what does he say? He says, I'm not going to answer your question, which is not really a question, but rather I will tell you that if you have an issue with the way that I look, go complain to the manufacturer. Right? Go complain to the craftsman with a capital C who made me. And say, how ugly is the vessel you made. You should have been capitalized there. When Rabbi Elazar realized that he had sinned and insulted this man merely on account of his appearance, he descended from his donkey and prostrated himself before him. And he said to the man, "I've sinned against you, forgive me." The man said to him, "I will not forgive you. I will not forgive you." Yeah, the go should not be there. "I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made." So he's like, "No, I'm not forgiving you. You go to Hashem, you go to God, and you tell God that you made an ugly vessel." So that's you. Now you have an issue with the way that I look. I have no control over that. You go speak with God if you have an issue with that. I'm not going to forgive you. He walked. So the man continues to walk. So he walked behind the man, trying to appease him, until they reached Rabbi Elazar's city. The people of his city came out. So again, they're walking. This man. Okay, Rabbi Elazar was riding on his donkey. This man was walking. He insults the man. The man kind of, tells him something that reorients his perspective and makes him wake up from his whatever he was in. And now he's walking after the man. And the man heads to the rabbi's city, Rabbi Elazar, where Rabbi Elazar lived. Now get this, listen to this. The people of the city came out to greet the rabbi, saying to him, "Greetings to you, my rabbi, my master, my master." Wait, greetings to you, my rabbi, my master, my master. The man said to them, "Who are you calling my rabbi, my rabbi?" They said to him, "To this man who is walking behind you." He said to them, "If this man is a rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people." They asked him, "For what reason do you say this?" He said to them, "He did such and such to me." So he spilled the beans. They said to him, "Even so, forgive him, as he is a great Torah scholar." He said to them, "For your sakes, I forgive him, provided that he accepts upon himself not to become accustomed to behave like this." In other words, don't do this again. Immediately, Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, entered the study hall and taught. A person should always be soft like a reed, and he should not be stiff like a cedar, as one who is proud like a cedar is likely to sin. And therefore, due to its let's finish this up. And therefore, due to its gentle qualities, the reed merited that a quill is taken from it to write with it a Torah scroll, phylacteries, and mezuzot scrolls. Okay, so let's understand this story. I just wanted to finish it off and not leave that last sentence hanging, but let's understand this story. Rabbi Elazar walks into the study hall and he begins teaching against the idea of being arrogant and I don't know what the word is. It's just full of self, just full of yourself.
Self-important.
You're self-important to the point where you look at others as beneath you, which is at the core of what happened. Now, this is a particularly harsh incident. By the way, in case you ever thought that the Talmud is like covering up or what, no, it's not. What? Study some Talmud. It just dishes the dirt on everyone. I know. I mean, not in a negative way, but in a way that, I don't mean that in a salacious way, but in a way where, if there's an instruction, if there's a lesson, it's not covering up and keeping the rabbis, perfect without any negative stories. Here you have a story that happened. He said something that was wrong, and he got called out on it, and he apologized, and he was forgiven. He repeatedly apologized the whole way through, walking with this guy behind him, apologizing constantly, finally forgiven, and then he taught his students about the lesson that he had learned about the dangers of arrogance. If you look at the opening of the story, what do we know about Rabbi Elazar? And what do we know about the man? Look how it's described. It's almost described, the way the Talmud crafts the story at the beginning of the second page, right? This top paragraph. It's crafted in a way to put us inside the headspace of Rabbi Elazar. Because we know everything about him and we know nothing about the man, which is the experience of when we're full of ourselves. We know everything about ourselves, who we are, where we come from, where we're going, what we just did, how important we are. We know everything, all the details, right? So his name was Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. He came from Migdal Gadar, from his rabbi's house. He was riding on a donkey, strolling on the bank of the river. He was very happy. His head was swollen with pride. He had studied much Torah. So much detail. And what do we know about the man? Nothing. Because, well, we don't even know that. We know that this guy, that the Rabbi Elazar called him ugly, right? But again, how often is it that we perceive things in a way because of where we are inside, right? And so here's a powerful lesson that what precipitates his disregarding of another human being, which the man tells him, do you know who I mean, not in an arrogant way, but you're speaking to a human being created by the divine, created in the divine image. So, again, not in an arrogant way. I'm going to say it. It's going to sound like he's saying it in an arrogant way. I don't mean it that way. But how can you call out another human being created in the divine image like that? And that's what he tells him. But we know nothing about this man. We know everything about Rabbi Elazar because that's what precipitates this. How is it that a person can totally devalue, dismiss, speak negatively to another human being? It's when they are not. It's when this person doesn't exist. It's your life, your situation, your context is so important, and that others. Again, I go back to my airport example. I have a flight. I got to catch this flight. Flight was delayed. This and that and the other. And the person standing there behind the counter doesn't exist as a human being. And I can say to them whatever it is that's on whatever I'm feeling, because I'm so important. I have all this stuff going on. Meanwhile, they're trying to do an impossible job, right? But I don't care. Because I'm entitled to whatever it is, because this is how I feel, or this is my situation. This happens this story happens all the time. Of course, present company excluded. Of course, present company excluded, right? The point is not a musar shmooze, which is like it's not about focusing on the negative, but it's understanding this lesson that so often we become consumed with who we are, where we are, what we're doing, what we need to be doing, what we want to be doing, that we forget that the other person in front of us is also a human being, a divine being, created in the divine image. Yeah.
I think I'm wondering if there's also there's one is the contrast between knowing everything about one person and not the other, but also that we think we know about somebody by the way that they look.
For sure.
We make immediate decisions or judgments, and so as if you see somebody and then you already know what the narrative is behind them based upon
right.
how they look.
Yeah. We do that all the time. Yeah. Judging people by appearance, by externalities. Yeah. That's right there. Yeah. He's looking at this person and totally defining him based on how he perceives him. there are many lessons to this story. The story and commentaries discuss this at length. I use this story in my book on inclusion, so it's in there. And there's a lot to be said about this story, many lessons. But the first lesson, I mean, the primary lesson is this is not okay, right? Primary lesson, it's not okay to judge someone like that, to not, based on appearance, to not practice the biblical mandate of loving the other as ourselves and extending dignity to another human being. Anyway, so there's a lot of stuff here. And there's also the notion this fellow ultimately does forgive the rabbi. So we have this idea of this person being able to forgive, ultimately, which is to his credit, he was able to forgive. And we have the rabbi taking it to heart, ultimately, and teaching his own mistake to his students. Yeah, a lot of lessons from this story. But again, the core point of the Talmud, at least zooming out, if you will, the way the Talmud begins and the way the story begins and the way the story ends is with this teaching: a person should always be soft like a reed and should not be stiff like a cedar, which again primarily means about with regards to arrogance. Don't be so full of ourselves, so stuck in our own way of seeing things, in our own feelings, our own ideas, our own heads and hearts, that we can't relate to another human being. That is destructive. That's negative. It's devastating. It's destructive. So now, with this in mind, any other questions, comments? Yeah.
This might be a small thing, but I love the fact that he was riding on a donkey when he first saw him. Because I'm imagining the rabbi on the donkey. He was very happy and proud about his Torah study. So when he's sitting on a donkey, your spine's erect. He's probably looking very proud as he's riding the donkey. Then when you see the person, you have to look down at him because the guy's walking. So
excellent.
That's a hard thing to you're already predisposed to feel like that.
You're already in that kind of
Judgment.
you're in that superior posture, literally. Yeah, great point.
I was thinking about your airport example. So it's like in this story, so we can unsee people or see them only, objectify them.
Correct.
Just get me on the plane. I
Yes.
don't even care who
Right.
you are. And
You don't have a story. I have a story. You have no story. My story is the only story here.
Yeah, and then this goes a little further. It's not just I don't care who you are. It's, you know what? I actually don't think you're even desirable on any level.
Yeah.
So it's like there's
It's worse.
It's
Yeah.
almost an attack.
It's very much an attack. It's unprovoked. The guy greets him,
Right.
and he says, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." He literally said, I'll tell you what it says in the original. Hold on. It says, "Shalom alecha, Rabbi." That's so nice. Shalom alecha, peace upon you, Rabbi. That's so nice. And totally just man.
Are there other examples in the Talmud teachings of Rabbi Elazar being this judgmental?
Harsh, yeah. It says after he got out of the cave, he was very harsh. I don't know how long this happened after he got out of the cave. They had to go into the cave because there was a Roman decree against the study of Torah and against the teachings of Torah. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a marked man. They wanted his head. The Romans wanted his head. This is shortly after the time of the destruction of the temple, and they had come down hard on.
What about after this? I mean, did he keep doing the same thing?
No, so here's what I was saying. So they hid in a cave for 12 years, and they come out of the cave, and the danger is past, and they spent 12 years in the cave living miraculously and studying the deepest secrets of Torah, Kabbalah. And they got out of the cave, and Rabbi Elazar, so Rabbi Shimon, his father, and Rabbi Elazar, his son, it says they were walking through from the cave through the fields, and Rabbi Elazar was looking at farmers in their fields, and he was so judgmental about them thinking that they're wasting their life. Instead of studying Torah, what are you doing? You're farming? You're spending your time farming? This was a man, there was a miraculous carob tree that provided for their food in the cave. So maybe thought everyone could eat by miracle, or Instacart. So the bottom line is his whatever, it's a thing. So his thought. So he looked so judgmentally at the farmers. It says that he was looking at them, and his gaze, like his look, was burning up the fields, whatever that means. And then God said, "I didn't let you out of the cave to harm, to destroy my world. Back into the cave." So they go back for a year, and then they come out, and then it was okay. But apparently, I don't know. So I don't know the timeline of when this story happens relative to the cave.
After he asked this guy to forgive him.
I would hope that he was warm and fuzzy. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe that's what he needed to hear.
Maybe that's what he needed to hear. I'll tell you this: the Talmud puts it in not as an attack on Rabbi Elazar. It's not lashon. This is not like a gossip. Talmud's not it's an instruction to us of sometimes you learn what to do, sometimes you learn what not to do, and this is a powerful illustration of how not to be on a few different levels, and about how to be. The man forgives, he takes it to heart, hopefully, and anyway, okay. So that's the story. Now let's jump into our Kabbalistic text. All right, let's jump into chapter 7 of our text. So we have a new start this week. Chapter 7. Let's pass these around. Here we go. Please take and pass if you have it. Fantastic. If not, more copies, fresh copies going around. If you have a copy that says chapter 1 on it, that's already, I was thinking about the word obsolete, but it's a terrible word to use for a Kabbalist text. But we're not, that booklet is no longer in use right now because that only has through chapter 5. This second packet has chapters 6 through 11. And we're now studying chapter 7. So you can find chapter 7 on page number 13. And we're about to jump in. Make sure that everybody has a copy. Okay, so last time we got together for Kabbalah Coffee, we spoke about fire and water. So I want to just quickly recap fire and water. Don't worry, we're going to get back to the reeds and the cedar and all that stuff in very, very momentarily. But first, a little bit about fire and water. So fire and water, we said, are within the natural world polar opposites. Water can undo fire, extinguish fire, and fire evaporates water. So each one is the other's nemesis. At least the way we observe it, in a normative fashion. However, we said that there is a way that fire and water can join together. And how is that so? If you break down fire and water into its detailed components, it says in Kabbalah, you will find that there are similarities between the two. And if you're able to highlight those similarities, then you can join them at their similar spaces and join together two opposites. And as I said 2 weeks ago, which was our last session, I am not right now qualified to explain this on a chemical level or based on, on a molecular level. Although somebody mentioned carbon, I think. Hydrogen. Told you I'm not qualified to. Hydrogen, right? So there are things that can cross over at both, which serve as perhaps hooks on a scientific level to understand this. But Kabbalistically, he says, the power of fire, the power of water, seen as they are in a revealed state, are opposites, but broken down into their details, you can find now similarities and commonalities that then can come together. He says the same thing is true with the powers of the soul. The powers of the soul, as they become manifest within the human being, within the human soul, they emerge in their own distinct way, and perhaps in ways that are opposite from the other power. So the power of giving is different than the power of withholding, and it might be very different, to the point that as they're manifest, you would say fire and water, right? They can't coexist. But if you go to the source, they come from the same source, and in the source, It's not that they exist as distinct beings in a source, but as they are in the source, they're so one, they don't even have their own distinctive qualities, and therefore, because of their essential oneness that precedes their individualism, so because of that essential oneness, as they emerge into distinct beings, they retain commonalities that therefore can help them come back together. We further said that when the two opposites come together, it's a combination of two factors. Number one, it happens by breaking down that entity into its essential components. So instead of just looking at it as chesed or gvura or fire and water, you're breaking it down into its essential components. Doing so allows you to find commonalities. When you dig deep, it's like, there's a common thread here between this and this. They look different, but if you break it down into all of the details of what this thing is, you see now. Wait a second. There's this thing here, and they're not as far apart as we might have thought. If you break it down, number one, number two, when you break it down, you create an overarching sense of bittul, which is lessening of the ego of that thing. And once you have the context, once you have a lessening of ego, then anything can come together. When there's ego in the way, nothing can come together. When there's a lessening of the ego, you can come together. So breaking something down into its components does two things. Number one, it helps you find commonalities. Number two, it helps diminish the ego, which can help things come together. Ego, I know, is usually understood in a human context. What I mean by ego is ego on every level. When it comes to the powers of the soul, chesed and gvura, they also have ego. Fire and water also have ego. I'm using ego a little bit loosely. There's no real the idea of bittul and yeshus, which are basically lack of ego and ego, don't really have good terms that can be universally applied to all elements as these terms are in Hebrew. So in English, it's a little bit difficult. So I'll just use the word ego, even though it's not, it's not typically understood. The last time, I've never heard somebody say, "Wow, that fire has a lot of ego," but it means feeling self to the point that it sees itself as, "I am fire, you are water, we can't get along." Right? That's the normative understanding of fire and water. I'm fire, you're water, can't get along. Or I'm water, you're fire, can't get along. If you break it down, you realize we have things in common. And once you break it down, you realize also, you know what? I'm not so much fire. I'm not exclusively fire. I have some water elements. And you're not exclusively water. You have some fire elements. So therefore, not only because of the commonalities can we get along, but also because we've taken away some of the self-importance and absolute importance of I am fire. That's all I am. Taking that away, once you cut down the ego a little bit, then you can get together.
Yeah, I very recently read a definition, I forget who gave the quote of definition of ego being the story of your future and your past, therefore your actual essence, and that's the story.
Right.
Real.
Right. It's what you tell yourself about yourself. Good.
So that's the fire. It has its past and its future, and this is its essence.
Great.
Its perceived essence.
In chapter 7, he talks about ideas and opinions, and how this applies to ideas that we have in our head, the ideas that we have in our mind and our brains. And how is it that a person who has one idea, a very strongly held idea, can possibly get along with someone else who holds a very different idea? Is it possible? It's possible. How? Stay tuned. Chapter 7. You don't have to stay tuned. Right now we're jumping in. Page 13 in the middle. After that little floral flourish, which I love. Looks like reeds in the water to me. Okay. The same chapter VII. Chapter 7. The same principle applies to the division effected by Chachma, which breaks down any concept into details. So look at what he says. You have an idea. Chachma and Bina, which we'll talk about soon, help break down a concept that begins, or we first imagine it as a singular concept, Chachma and the other cognitive powers help break down the idea into pieces. When you break down an idea into pieces, now there's hope to come together with what appears to be an opposite idea. Because until you've broken it down, it's just one idea. And if that's a different idea, then it's clashing ideas. But when you have an idea, this is on any level. This is a very general, universal terms that he's speaking of right now. You have any idea, right? It begins as one. The cognitive process, Chachma Bina Dat, is breaking it down into pieces. That's the division invented by Chachma, breaks down any concept into details. Let's continue. As a concept first appears, it is an undifferentiated seminal point. The way we would call this in Hebrew is a nekuda. Nekuda is a point. So like a line versus a point. So it doesn't have any dimension to it at all. Doesn't have like width, depth, breadth. It's just a singular point. That's how all ideas begin. They begin as a nekuda, a point. So as a concept first appears, it appears as an undifferentiated seminal point without details. Classic example is, I said this a few weeks ago also, when you're working on a problem and you're struggling to understand something or figure out something or come up with an idea, and then you have the light bulb goes off, right? At least that's the way it's depicted in comic books. You have the light bulb that goes off above the person's head, like, I got it. At that point, you got it. What did you get? You can't yet, you don't even know yet those details. All that went off is an awareness that you got it. So there's some nekuda, there's some point that you got, but you don't have it broken down yet into the details. And hence, it is an undifferentiated seminal point, the details, and hence has nothing in common with another concept which seems to contradict it. At that point, that seminal point, at that point of the idea, it's undifferentiated, i.e. it's not a complex idea with different shades to it, right? It's just a core point. At that point, it has nothing in common with the opposing point. One point and another point, they're different points, and they stand on opposite sides, and they clash. The power of intellect, back inside, the power of intellect breaks down the concept into its many components and details, including even propositions that are antithetical and contradictory to the original concept. If you are really intellectually honest and really pursue an idea on all of its levels, you start off with an idea, with a seminal point, with a nekuda, with a point, and then you seek to understand it in all of its components, on all of its levels, and you break it down, you will discover contradictory elements to the very point as it started, which is very akin to what we said before about fire and water, that if you break down fire into all of its detailed components, you will discover there's water in fire, and there's fire in water, or elements of water and fire and elements of fire and water. Even though as they stand, in their core, fire and water are opposites, complete opposites. But nonetheless, when you break it down, you realize that the opposite is in the thing itself. That opposite that was across the aisle is on the same side as well. In fire, in water, and in ideas. Ideas begin very strong and very concentrated. But when you really understand, you really break down something, you can come up with contradictory notions. I'll give you a very simple example. The story of the flood. Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Joking. It's a Pennsylvania. Growing up in Pittsburgh, we knew about the Johnstown flood, right? Was that Johnstown? Was a flood? Early 1900s? Wow. All right. Moving along. The great flood of Noah, right? Noah's Ark, The animals? Okay. All right. Good. Heard that story before. All right. That's gotten a little bit more press. So, why does God destroy the world? So, before the flood, the rationale is given in the Bible. The Torah says, God says, the nature of human beings is corrupt. From the get-go, we got to wipe this out, wipe out mankind, start again. After the flood, God promises to Noah, he'll never do this again. Why? Because the nature of human beings is corrupt, so what do you expect? It's virtually the same rationale. The rationale for creating the flood is because people are rotten, or people are no good inside. And the rationale for not bringing another flood and being patient is because, all right, what do you expect? People have their challenges, they have their temptations. What are you going to do? You expect perfection? It's virtually the same in the Torah text. It's almost indistinguishable one from the other, which tells us, imagine the first thought that comes to mind is, this is not working out. It's corrupt. It's broken. We have to whatever this is, right? Being very vague, right? Obviously, because it could apply to anything. This is not working. This is no good. It's flawed. Whatever. So we have to get rid of it. Okay, that's one notion. If you break it down, you might move to a place of compassion and say, it's not working. Why is it not working? How can we help it? Maybe I want to help it, right? As opposed to getting rid of it, maybe we can help. Maybe we can provide some tools to help. So you take an idea that begins in a very strong fashion, but when you break it down and you think about it a little bit more, you might move to a different place. The question is why, if God is God, then, how come God didn't think of that other approach before the flood? What changed before and after the flood? There's a lot to talk about. Kabbalah explains that it wasn't even a punishment, it was a cleansing process, a cosmic mikvah, whatever. There's a lot to discuss about the flood. I don't mean to really jump into that's a weird expression. I don't mean to take a deep dive, much better, into the flood. However, I just wanted to cite it as an example where you can take an intellectual argument, break it down, and come to the polar opposite conclusion. Then you start it. You can start off thinking one way, but you break down the elements of the argument and end up arguing the opposite. In the Talmud, you have countless examples. Literally I guess you can count them. So literally is not accurate there. That's the figuratively literally example. So you have hundreds, this I can go literally hundreds of examples of disputes between sages. For example, Hillel and Shammai, or Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the academies of Hillel and Shammai, who start off with the same points, same Torah, same teachings, even same logic on some level, and then branch off into different places. You start off with the same ideas, break it down, end up in different places, but the amazing thing is, when you take any one of those arguments, individual arguments, or perspectives, and break them down, there's commonality between the two, even though one might say kosher, the other one might say not kosher. At the core, they're agreeing on more than they're disagreeing. It's coming out in a way of, different opinions, but at its core, you can find commonalities between them. So let's continue. I'm actually in the middle of a sentence, so I'm going to start again from the sentence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the beginning of chapter 7. Last word on the line is the power of intellect breaks down the concept into its many components and details, including even propositions that are antithetical and contradictory to the original concept. For, as previously explained, at the level of essence, each entity contains its opposite within itself, which means that even as these ideas emerge in their nekuda, in their point state, they originally come from a place of oneness where they are one with the other idea, and therefore, even as they emerge into distinct spaces, if you really break it down, you will find commonalities between them. Let's continue. Similarly, every intellectual concept necessarily, this is a powerful word, necessarily, every intellectual concept, assuming it's intellectual, necessarily includes many different and contradictory elements. When a concept is thoroughly broken down and divided into its component parts, each part will inevitably express itself in directions and points which differ from the other parts. As long as you don't break it down, it seems monolithic. It's one point. And it may be very different from the other point that's also monolithic. Whereas when you break it down into its components, you realize this thing itself is a contradiction. Not a contradiction. This thing itself has contradictory ideas and notions. This itself could be understood in different ways. What do I mean? Forget what the other person means. What's my idea? There are many different ways to understand my idea, even within myself. However, there is a reason, justification, and logic behind each of the contradictory aspects. Or the same reason and logic may sometimes be responsible for both a particular concept and its inherent antithesis. Very interesting what he says here. He says, when you have different components within you start off with a single logical idea, a point, the nakuda. And then you break it down through the power of intellect into its details, into its components. So you start off with a nakuda, with a point, and then you've broken it down into its components. And the components are now not all the same. You have different components, and some of these components to the other components are contradictory. Some are complementary, but some are contradictory. So he says, how is it possible that in the same idea you can have contradictory notions? Within the same idea, you can have contradictory notions. He says it's two reasons. Either because there's a reason, justification, and logic behind each of the contradictory aspects. So in other words, within this one idea, there are multiple rationales that drive its many components. Or he says, the same reason and logic can cause both this idea and its antithesis. In other words, either you have different rationales that are driving the different components, or it's the same rationale that necessitates, almost, that drives contradictory components. When this occurs, let's finish the paragraph. When this occurs, they are not actually contradictory. The components that seem contradictory are not actually contradictory, but on the contrary, they strengthen and aid each other. It is only through this process that an idea can be clearly and thoroughly grasped and apprehended from each of its standpoints and dimensions. If you don't break down an idea and understand all of its particulars and all of its components and all of its contradictions, if you don't understand the paradox of the idea, then you don't understand the idea. Then you haven't fully grasped the idea. That's what he says. The only way you can clearly and thoroughly grasp an idea is when you've apprehended it, when you've understood it from each of its standpoints and dimensions, even the ones that are the opposite. Hence, once you do this process, hence it can be joined and synthesized with another concept, for they are not contradictory. On the contrary, they complement and reinforce each other. Once you've done that to any single concept, you can now join this single concept with another single concept, because you've realized that the single concept is not so simple and not so single as it appears. It's complex, it's contradictory, there are paradoxes, it all makes sense, none of it makes sense, but now you can join it with another idea, because that idea is also complex. Like we said with fire and water. Fire is fire, water is water, not so fast. Fire has water, water has fire. They can join in on two levels. Number one, the common hooks can join, but also the general notion of not viewing this as so rigid can help get along with the other, seeing that also being seen as not so rigid. So my idea, which is complex, and your idea, which is complex, there's nuance now. Now we can have a farbrengen. Now we can have a discussion. There's nuance in the conversation. It's not, if the opinion is this, and that's that, then there's no conversation. If it's a nuanced understanding, right? If my opinions are nuanced, I understand it's not so simple, even the things that are obvious to me. I'm able to intellectually be honest and break it down and say, not so fast. this element means this, that element means the other. And you know what? Even within my ideas, I have other elements that speak to other values and other ideas, on whatever level it is. So when we have this complexity, this differentiation within our own understanding, we're more likely and more attuned to getting to being able to synthesize with a different idea. So when there's nuance, number one, there are common hooks, but number two, there's also a lessening of the force in which we maintain our positions.
I'm confused. No, I'm not confused. So, you said before, you referenced sort of that idea as a logical idea. But are we always talking about a logical? The way that I've understood it, and now I'm understanding that the understanding is
Complex.
The way that I've thought about Chachma is this kind of purity of idea.
Yeah.
And that once it's shared, it's no longer that, because just think about a variety of different commentaries. Everyone's coming at that from their own ideas, their own perspectives.
Right.
So that kind of purity of that idea, and I'm thinking about when you're trying to explain something, you say, no, that's not what I meant. That you're because it's residing in a way of I think of that as almost not as having no boundaries in some way, so that as an idea it has to move away, as I'm understanding it from Chachma, to really being more about that understanding. But its purity, it's almost as if in its purest form, it's not something to be analyzed. Once it becomes analyzed, it has its boundaries, it has its
So you're asking a very good question, and I think this is a great example. I can model this process in your question and my response to your question.
Good.
All right. Usually, Kabbalah explains that Chachma is the Nekuda, is the point, and Bina is where a thing is broken down. And here he says Chachma is where it's broken down.
Right.
I think that's your question.
Yeah, I was even questioning that too. I was like, I thought that.
But isn't it amazing if we would come to the place and say maybe Chachma is not as monolithic as we thought? Maybe Chachma is not.
I really want
Maybe
just read that in
Chachma.
here.
Huh?
He says in here the power of Chachma is intuitive, holistic, and experiential. It's manifested in our right brain. The power of Bina, which is analytical, logical, and rational, is manifested in our left brain. I think that's what she's saying.
Right. Yeah. No. And Sandy reminds us that right brain and left brain are not as monolith, not as binary as we otherwise might think. But the point is like this. Chachma, again, you're right. Chachma is usually described as the place in intellect, the power of intellect of the nekuda, of the point. Seeing the idea as it is objectively and not yet interpreting, not yet breaking it down. We've explained that in previous sessions here as well. And in a previous chapter, he described that that's more of a process of Bina and downward. But at the same time, there are elements of this in Chachma already. Chachma begins seeing something. The moment of observation is the moment in which we begin to differentiate.
Yeah, Chachma still is. It still has like it's still bound a little bit.
Still a little bit.
It's just open.
Right.
Whereas Bina is like completely like. It's
correct.
bound.
Right. If you really want to speak in like the clearest terms, we would say is Chachma is this, Bina is that.
Yeah.
But I think the point here is to understand how there's more. What's the word I'm looking for? There's more connections. There's more integration. That's a great word. There's more integration than the whole point is integration, right? So if we were to speak about this in absence, no, Chachma is this and Bina is that. Great. So you're now in the process of integration. You're now creating solid divisions between the intellectual powers. So I think there's almost something beautiful here about a little bit blurring the lines. The process of breaking down an idea into its points is definitely a Bina process.
Yeah.
But Chachma starts the process.
Yeah,
Chachma is still the observation. You're still somehow bound, as you said, still somehow creating boundaries around around an idea as you originally perceive it. It's still your perception of it, even in that seminal level. So there are still elements of that thing, but in truth, it's really chachma down. If I recall correctly, because I prepare from the Hebrew, and sometimes I read the English before, and sometimes I just like to surprise myself. I recall in chapter 7 that he starts off by talking about chachma, but later on in the same chapter he says chachma and down, something like that. So, give me a second here. Let me find where that's. It's easier for me to find this in the Hebrew. Yeah, later on he says the moichin. Moichin are powers of the mind, without specifying chachma. Let's see, does he mention something else? Yeah, let's see if he says this. Where is it in English? Okay, listen, let's keep on going, we'll see. You're right, listen, so my first response is, you're right. Chachma is primarily the point, and Bina is primarily the breakdown. Yeah.
So that maybe rather than that, you have more of a Venn diagram. If you have to, I mean, if you're
You have
limited
to.
to that kind of a dimension,
Right.
it's more of that.
If you're twisting our arm, we'll have to go with this. We'll have to go with
This is the
that.
problem.
Right. But you also have a chesed and gevura.
Yeah.
Right? Chesed, think about it. You know what? Chesed and gevura is a really great example. Chesed is about giving, and gevura is about withholding. And it's nekuda in its point form. But break it down. Why are you giving? Why are you giving? Because you love, because you value, because you appreciate. Great. Can you appreciate that sometimes if you love, the best thing is not to give? Correct. So, I love you, therefore I'm not going to give you this thing. Right. Or I'm not getting, no, on a very simple level. A child wants to cut, right? Child wants to help, not in a negative way. Child wants to help and wants to cut up the salad for dinner. This happens all the time. My kids want to cut up. They want to help cut up the cucumbers and other vegetables. Riva, well, no. So Riva says, my little one, the 3-year-old, she says she wants to cut the cucumbers. We're like, great, here's a plastic knife. She's like, come on, she's been around for a few years now. She knows what's going on. She knows the responsibility, right? She's been around the block, you know. She knows what's going on. So she's like, no, I want like we have like a sharp, very sharp knife. So she wants the knife, and at some point the question is, so what does love say? Is love always giving? Right? So you have an idea, a notion of giving, and a notion of withholding. And there couldn't be a more polar opposites. Giving is giving and withholding is withholding. And yet, you make it a little bit more nuanced and you realize, no, giving is sometimes not giving. And not giving is sometimes giving. It's the way it is. So that's just one example of where we see that. Now, that's not addressing your question of Chachma Bina, but it is saying that it's modeling this process, yeah.
But it is too, and I think sort of going back to, the thing that always gets to me is this hemisphere, that hemisphere, and so on, is that even in the affective, it's all happening simultaneously. So it's not like you're just thinking about it intellectually or something. It's all connected. At any one point, anything that you're doing is all connected. So in some ways, it's that it's working. This is the wrong way to talk about it, as a system in a way. That these are all
100%. That's why the lines are drawn, and that's why it's drawn as a partsuf. 3 lines as opposed to just straight down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I introduced my kids recently to the Sesame Street. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You know this one?
Yes.
Love that. My kids love that now. That has nothing to do with anything. I'm just saying that drawing something in a straight line, pinball machines, drawing that in a straight line would create a sort of self-contained appearance, whereas putting it on three columns is actually not about creating differentiation. It's about creating integration, which, by the way, if we want to use these terms, that's a great word, right? Again, so if we want to use these words, he says the key to integration is differentiation. The key to integration is differentiation. When you break something down into its components, now you can start to integrate. On a very simple level, it means every one of us has our opinions, on whatever level it is. the more we understand how we feel, not this is how I feel, but the more we, in a nuanced way, understand why we feel how we feel, and understand all of the complexities of our feelings and our ideas, the more we'll realize that there's a lot in common with perhaps other ideas. Let's continue inside. The ability, here we go. The ability of intellect. Oh, this is why it's Chachma also, because Chachma is always bittul. But okay. The ability of intellect to dissect any matter into its many components so that apparent opposites can be joined stems from its quality of bittul. How is it that the mind can take an idea and divide it into the details so that it can be co-joined and integrated with another idea that may seem opposite to it at first glance? How is that possible? How can the mind break down ideas into components that within itself are contradictory? It's because the mind has bittul, which means it doesn't need to be stuck. Emotions are very arrogant by nature. Not all emotions. You have hod, which is humility, which is not arrogant, obviously, but emotions are how I feel. Whereas intellect is a little bit more about bittul. It's about understanding that thing the way it is. When the rabbi called that fellow ugly, was he speaking from a place of intellect or a place of emotion? What do you think? Right? It's not a place of intellect. So he says the intellect has the ability to break down a concept into many components so that it can be understood in a nuanced fashion, so that it can be integrated with another idea. That all stems from the power of bittul, the quality of bittul. Bittul means letting go of ego on whatever level. That is a power of the mind. By the way, it doesn't mean that all our ideas are selfless or self-effacing, or are bittul, or have bittul in it. We could have very arrogant ideas, but it means that the ability that we have to introduce this, that is an intellectual ability. In this spirit, our sages counseled, and now we have the quote from Taina 20a and 20b. In this spirit, our sages counseled, i.e. the Talmud instructs us, a person should always be pliant, a different translation, same idea, pliant like a reed and not hard like a cedar. When something is hard, it's coarseness and yeshus. So yeshus means ego. Yesh means is. Yeshus is like isness. Right? It's isness. It's or I-ness. It's like me. Right? When something is hard, its coarseness and yeshus do not permit it to bend in any direction. Why does the cedar, again, this is no offense to cedars because they're just trees, or not just trees, but they're trees and they don't have any, there's no malicious intent here. But the point is, we're like understanding it through that example, that analogy. Why is the cedar not pliant? Because it's so I don't know.
It's got another job to do.
Well, that's a nice way of looking at it. Or in this way, or it's all about itself. So it's all about itself. I'm not bending for anybody, right? Why would I yield to you? Why would I turn this way? I want to go this way. I'm going to go this way. I'm going to grow this way. I'm not moving any other way. By contrast, so look what it says. Its coarseness and yeshus do not permit it to bend in any direction. I love that phrase. It doesn't allow it to bend. Ego doesn't allow us to compromise. It says, don't compromise. You're going to lose, you can't lose. That's what ego says. Ego doesn't allow bending. By contrast, the reed, right? By contrast, inherent softness, like the reed, allows the thing to bend in all directions. In fact, it necessitates bending. It says when you come up against something, maybe first approach is to bend. The same applies to intellect, which is likened to the reed. Because it possesses the quality of bittul, it can bend in any direction, i.e. it analyzes each concept into many particular parts and details. And now we have the Kabbalah of the reed and cedar. The cedar represents ego, which in general is represented by emotions. The cedar. Cedar is proud and tall and strong and not bending, not yielding. Whereas the reed is likened to the mind. The reed is like intellect, intelligence, which, again, it's not always like this, but the ideal is that it be infused with the quality of bittul, which is the quality of, first and foremost, recognizing that this point is not so simple. It's nuanced. And once I understand the nuance, I can understand someone else's nuance. And now I can integrate ideas together. Through this process, even opposites are joined together and synthesized into a single entity. When many different parts fuse into one, reinforcing each other to the point where the beginning of one and the end of another cannot be discerned, the ultimate level of unity and synthesis is achieved. He says the ultimate goal, the ultimate manifestation, or the ultimate experience of synthesis is where you have the many parts that are all coming together so that you can't even determine or discern where the beginning is, where the end is, what the top is, what the bottom is. It's like a circle where there's no beginning and end. It's perfectly synthesized together. And then he says, then each quality reinforces and benefits from another. Each detail leads to the other. This is true unity, for no opposition exists. So the goal is differentiation, breaking it down, the humility to recognize that it's not so monolithic, that there is nuance, and once there's nuance, now the pieces are not contradictory, although they are contradictory, but they actually complement each other, and now there's differentiation, integration, contradiction, complementary, and they all come together in a perfect synthesis and joining within the idea itself and within amongst other ideas that began as contradictory. So, due to time constraints, we're going to stop right here. We're not going to finish chapter 7 this week because the truth is, I do want to elaborate more on what we just read because it's very important. So I want to elaborate more. So next week we're going to start off with this middle paragraph on 14 and just go through that once more. We'll finish chapter 7, maybe even break into chapter 8, and that's all next time. So what's the point of today? The point today is that ideas are not as simple as they appear. Ideas begin as simple. Simple, I mean as an akuda. Simple, this is the idea. But if you break down an idea, oftentimes you'll notice there's complexity. And complexity is good. It's not good. Complexity is good. Because first of all, we fully understand it when there's complexity. Number two, we realize how this idea necessitates, not only contains, but necessitates the opposite, which allows us to recognize how opposites are more alike than we seem. And once we've done that, then we can get along perhaps a little bit better with someone else's opinion on whatever it is. All right, thank you very much for joining me today for Kabbalah and Opinions. Thank you, very kind. A few quick announcements. Number one, we are having a very important event, Monday, January 13th. When I originally worked on this event with the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Bremen Museum, I knew it was important, but I don't think I realized. I mean, it's not a good thing, but it's even more. I think it's even more timely and important today as it was when I first worked on this event. This is called Life After Hate. T.M. Garrett grew up in Germany, and in his younger years, he was a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi. Actually, was a leader of a KKK group in Germany, and he completely turned his life around through an unbelievable story. And today, he helps people get out of hate groups. He is going to share with us, first of all, his story, but also an incredible perspective of how people get into hate groups and how people can get out of hate groups, which is, in my opinion, right? It's critically important for us to understand what drives hate and what can neutralize hate, what can make hate go away, huh?
Break it down.
Break it down, understand it, understand where he was, how he got out, and how today he's dedicated his life to helping people get out of hate groups. So this is, that's here, right here in this space, right here, literally in this room. Monday, January 13th, again in conjunction with the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Bremen Museum. So join us, please, and please spread the word. It's a very important community event. That's 5:30, the talk will start. Okay, we have also, I don't know if I've put this out yet. This may be the first time I have the flyers. Spiritual Development Masterclass. This is Keys to Unlocking Human Potential with spiritual mentor Mrs. Nomi Freeman. She just taught a course, a month and a half ago on the Kabbalah of the supernatural, or Jewish secrets to the supernatural, and now she's teaching a spiritual development masterclass. The topics are mind control, master thought controlling techniques, change, transform unwanted personality traits, trust, live within a higher embrace, joy, increase joy in your daily life, positivity, liberate yourself from fear, anger, and anxiety, nurturing love, learn how to truly open your heart, and law of attraction, get what you want the Jewish way. So these are 7 topics: mind control, change, trust, joy, positivity, nurturing love, law of attraction. She is an incredible teacher. She's a spiritual mentor. She speaks on many spiritual topics, including near-death experiences. She's not speaking about that in this session, but she is incredibly gifted spiritually, and it is a wonderful opportunity to join. So if you want to learn more about it, grab a flyer, look it up on the website, and join us for that. You will love it. All right, that's all.